Blessed Jane of Maille of the Third Order, by Franciscan Herald. Blessed Jane Mary, the daughter of the wealthy Baron of Maille, was born 1331, in the castle of La Roche, near the town of St. Quentin, in France. She was called Jane in baptism, and, on account of her great devotion to the Mother of God, she took the name of Mary in confirmation. As a child, she delighted in saying the Hail Mary and in weaving garlands of flowers to adorn the statue of Our Lady. Under the prudent guidance of a son of St. Francis, who held the position of chaplain of the castle, Jane rapidly advanced in perfection by the practice of self-denial, mortification, prayer, and works of mercy. She made herself an oratory in a retired part of the castle, and there, prostrate before a crucifix, she spent many hours in fervent converse with God. It was her delight to read the lives of the saints, and incited by their heroic virtues to grow in the spirit of self-sacrifice, she resolved to consecrate her virginity to God. When Jane was 15 years of age, her father died, and she was placed under the guardianship of her grandfather, who made it one of his first cares to provide for the future of his ward. He chose as husband for her the virtuous Robert, Baron of Maille. At this news, Jane, desirous of belonging to God alone, was appalled. She redoubled her prayers and austerities to obtain the help of God in this difficulty. In a heavenly vision she was reassured, however, that the union was pleasing to God, and that her virtue would receive the reward she so ardently desired. The marriage ceremonies were celebrated with great pomp, but the wedding day was turned into a day of mourning, for in the evening Jane's grandfather departed this life. This sad and unexpected event made a deep impression on all, and induced the young Baron of Maille to yield to the desires of his bride to lead a life of virginity. This chaste union, which lasted 13 years, was sanctified by the practice of sublime virtues. The holy couple made it their first care to regulate their household according to the will of God. Only virtuous and God-fearing persons were engaged as servants. Everyone in the castle was bound to fulfill faithfully the duties of religion. Games of chance, quarrels, frivolous language, and cursing were strictly prohibited. These wise and pious regulations were enforced by the example of Jane and her husband. The poor always received a hearty welcome, and they never left the castle without being consoled and assisted in their need. Thus, for about 10 years, the virtuous couple had led a truly happy life, for no joy is so pure as that which springs from virtue. But human life, especially in the case of the saints, is a continual alternation of consolations and trials. God was now about to demand of blessed Jane a great sacrifice. At that time, the 100 Years' War was raging in France. The English, after devastating the southern provinces, were advancing toward the center of the kingdom. Summoned by his king, Robert of Maille armed his men and marched out to the defense of his country, and after distinguishing himself by his bravery, fell seriously wounded. He had scarcely recovered from his wounds, when his castle was stormed by the English and he was carried off a prisoner. During this severe trial, blessed Jane, far from murmuring against divine providence, blessed the hand of God which weighed heavily upon her, and came forth from the visitation purified and more detached from earthly things. Through her efforts, her husband was at length restored to liberty, and together they henceforth vied with each other in the performance of works of piety and charity. After the death of her husband, in 1362, blessed Jane was bitterly persecuted by his family, but even when she was cruelly deprived of a large part of her property and obliged to beg for shelter in the cottage of a poor woman, she did not lose her peace of heart, but, like Saint Elizabeth, thanked God and deemed herself happy in having no other possessions than Jesus crucified. With a view of serving God with greater freedom, she went to Tours and took up her abode in a poor lodging near the church of St. Martin. Here she entered the Third Order of St. Francis, and henceforth always wore the habit outwardly, in spite of the ridicule she met with. She now devoted herself with renewed zeal to works of charity, in which she spent all her time not given to prayer. She visited the poor and the sick, rendered every charitable service to the lepers, and by her prayers and prudent zeal effected the conversion of many who had given themselves up to a life of sin. To these acts of charity, she joined the practice of the greatest self-denial and mortification. She spent the greater part of the night in prayer, sleeping for a short time on the bare ground. Besides the fasts prescribed by the Church and the rule of the Third Order, she kept 4 Lents during the year, and fasted on bread and water on 4 days of every week. In her love for holy poverty, she divested herself of all her possessions, renounced any property that might eventually devolve on her, and lived on alms. It might be supposed that the example of so many virtues would have attracted the respect and veneration of men, but God permitted it to be otherwise. Jane was treated as foolish and mad, and persecuted with ridicule and insults to such an extent that she was obliged several times to change her abode. She at length found an asylum in a poor dwelling near the Church of the Franciscans in Tours. In this humble retreat, Blessed Jane was to spend the last 27 years of her life and to exercise a holy influence which was to be felt even at the royal court. She begged her daily bread, practiced the greatest austerities, and spent many hours of the day and night before the tabernacle in contemplation. By her prayers and exhortations, she obtained the conversion of many sinners. She visited the prisoners, provided for their needs, and in many cases procured their release. Needy churches were also the object of her pious solicitude. By her help and example, many were repaired and provided with the things necessary to celebrate the divine mysteries with due reverence. In 1395, Blessed Jane visited Paris, where she had several audiences with King Charles VI. The influence of these interviews was soon felt in a number of royal statutes in favor of the people and the prisoners and in the removal of abuses existing at the court. Her influence was also exercised in a most salutary manner during the Great Schism, which caused so much confusion in the Church of God. Like the other saints who lived at the time, Blessed Jane not only unceasingly implored God to hasten the end of the scandal which afflicted the Church to the detriment of numerous souls, but she instituted for this purpose processions and public prayers, and as a reward, she received a revelation making known the coming peace of the Church. After laboring for the honor of God and the salvation of souls by a life of voluntary poverty, humility, mortification, and prayer, Blessed Jane was at length called to her eternal reward. She passed away on March 28, 1414, in the 82nd year of her age. She was entombed in the Church of the Friars Minor at Tours. Pope Pius IX, in 1871, confirmed the veneration shown her from time immemorial. Taken from the article Blessed Jane of Maille of the Third Order, published in the April 1917 edition of the magazine Franciscan Herald. The author is not listed, but was probably Father Silas Barth.